two-story building located about a mile off of Duke's West Campus is the home of the Rhine Research Center, which was formerly known as the Duke Parapsychology Laboratory up until 1964, when psychology professor J.B. Rhine retired and took the lab off campus. It's also the international headquarters of IANS, which is the International Association for Near-Death Studies. I've been an active member of both of these organizations for many years. Sometimes, when I go out to dinner before one of our monthly meetings with a lot of my friends who've had near-death experiences, I'm sitting at the table and I feel kind of left out. When I realize that I think I'm the only one who hasn't already died, or at least nearly died and gone to see the light and then come back to tell us all about it. I'm always fascinated with their stories, and as a physician, I've had my share of encounters with death in the hospital over the last 40 years. The most important of these happened recently when my mother died of metastatic breast cancer in 2016. My nephew Shane traveled 36 hours straight from Australia to take this selfie with her at the bedside. And he also joined another of her grandchildren, my daughter Laurel, who's here in the audience today. Mom was awake and alert and thrilled to see all of us gathered in the room with her. Now, the next morning, my brother Peter got an urgent call from the palliative care doctor letting us know that she's on the way out and we better get there quickly. We all arrived as rapidly as we could, and by the time we got there, she had her eyes tightly shut. She was breathing rapidly, but she could still, thankfully, communicate with us. My sister Christine asked her one important question. She said, "What are you experiencing, Mom?" And she managed to say, "It's getting very white in here." And we took that as a good sign that she was nearing the end. A few minutes later, she quit responding to us, and she shifted into this sort of rhythmic chant, like a mantra almost. It's all right, it's okay, it's all right, it's okay, as if she was reassuring herself that it was safe to go into the light. This went on for about a half an hour, and she rode that mantra right out of this world and was gone. And we were all just awestruck at how smooth her transition was. And her description of her consciousness being flooded with light at the end reminded me of a series of #1 best-selling books that dominated the New York Times list in the early 90s. And they all had light in the title. And they were all about near-death experiences. 2 of them were by a pediatrician named Melvin Morse, Closer to and Transformed by the Light. Now, his first book was based on his research from 1986 on childhood near-death experiences, in which he describes all the classic characteristics of leaving the body, going into the tunnel, toward the light, seeing deceased relatives on the way, and then getting to the threshold and making a decision to come back into the body. The second book was about transformation that's been reported to occur after near-death experiences. And it's been confirmed in many peer-reviewed papers over the last few years, including this one from 1998. And I'm going to mention more about transformations later in the talk. There was a second wave of near-death experience bestsellers 2 decades later, starting in 2012. And reading those books inspired me to write a series of blogs about near-death experiences, culminating in this one, Spiritual Alphabet Soup, which is the basis for this TEDx talk. It describes 4 acronyms related to liminal states of death and dying. The research on these topics is basically focused on subjective reports from the experiencers. NDE is reported to occur in about 4% of the population. NDA is a much more common occurrence. SDE is a relatively rare event. And ADC is reported to occur in about 40% of the population, so very common. I'm going to touch on each one of these acronyms, share a little bit of the science, and then some of my personal experiences. So we'll start with NDE, and Morse described these 4 traits of transformation in his book. And I was having a conversation with one of my radiology fellows who I'd spent a year training in MRI and never had a metaphysical conversation the whole year until that last month. And as I'm going through the first 3 traits, he got very quiet. And he said, I've never shared this with anybody before, but when I was 13, I had a serious accident. I wound up losing consciousness due to a head injury. And when I finally woke up, I felt strangely different, although I hadn't seen a tunnel or a light. But afterwards, I had no fear of death. And I'd been the class clown before the accident. Afterwards, I came back as a straight-A student on a mission to go to med school. And I always seem to know who's on the other end of the phone when it rings before I pick it up. And I said, whoa, where's your watch? Pointing to his wrist. And he goes, oh, I can't wear a watch, it stops all the time. And he said, my wife gets it fixed, it still doesn't work. And I pointed out that was the 4th trait of transformation, electromagnetic phenomena. And there's actually a paper on this from 2015 where they describe not only watch malfunctions, but laptops, cell phones, and even lights flickering on and off when someone who's had a near-death experience walks into the room. And these events don't occur as commonly in people who haven't had a near-death experience. So at this point, I'd just like to do a quick poll of the audience. Anyone think that they may have had a near-death experience? You can raise your hand. Okay, so I see a few people. We expect it's fairly 1 out of 25 people. In an audience like this, you'll see maybe half a dozen or a dozen. So the next acronym is NDA, which is Nearing Death Awareness. And the lead researcher in this field is Christopher Kerr, who's Chief of Palliative Care in Buffalo. He's famous for having given a wildly popular TED Talk called I See Dead People. It has over 4 million views, and it's based on this research published in 2014 on the benefits of deathbed dreams and visions for people who are dying to decrease their anxiety and make their transition smoother. One example commonly described is the so-called welcoming committee. That's when you're in a room with someone who's dying and they're talking to deceased relatives who you can't see, and as if they're coming to greet them. Now, I had an experience of my dad's nearing death awareness, Thanksgiving of 1993, when he was pretty much in denial of the fact that he was dying of metastatic kidney cancer. Now, he was a steel mill executive and described this dream to me of being in the rolling mill and climbing up into the rafters to get a higher perspective on what's going on down in the mill. Now, in a rolling mill, you take a red-hot, big, thick steel ingot and you roll it down, flattening it through a progressive series of stands, getting thinner and thinner until you roll it up on the coil at the end like depicted in this picture. Now, he said he was looking down at the last stand right before the coil gets rolled up. He had no idea what this dream meant. I knew immediately, and I said, Dad, wouldn't it make sense that your subconscious would use symbols you're familiar with to communicate an important message that you're getting close to the end of the line in your life? Fortunately, that insight penetrated through some of his denial and made his transition a couple months later smoother. The next acronym is SDE for Shared Death Experiences, described in this paper from 2021. Some of these occur when a relatively intuitive person is at the bedside of someone who's dying. At the point of death, they go into an altered state of consciousness, and they report seeing the person leave their body and go up into the tunnel toward the light. But they also have an out-of-body experience and go with them, accompanying them to the threshold where they're sent back, and the other person continues on to the light and dies. These can also occur remotely, where the person who has the experience is not in the same room with the dying person. It might be a dream or a vision. I had a dream that I think fits this description in 2000 when my elderly Aunt Betty was dying of long illness with severe chronic lung disease. Early that morning, I had this vivid dream that just was, she appeared looking much younger than her actual age. Something like this picture. And she's waving at me. She's in the prime of life. And she said, little Betsy's going home. Called my mother the next morning, and sure enough, her sister had died a couple hours earlier. I asked her about the little Betsy comment because that was puzzling to me. And she said, oh, that was your Uncle Walt's pet nickname for her that no one else used. And I had no conscious recollection of hearing that name, which made the dream all the more interesting. The final acronym is ADC, or after-death communication, which can occur commonly in the dream form, like just described. But similar visions can occur in the waking state, in which case the psychiatrist would describe that as a visual hallucination, like in this paper from 2021. Regardless of what you call it, it has the impact of decreasing grief in the experiencer. And now, it can also occur as symbolic messages like rainbows or visitations by birds. And my favorite of these is so-called pennies from heaven. I first heard about this in a lecture at the Ryan Research Center in 2002, described as finding a surprising coin in an unexpected location that happens to have the date of a loved one's death on it. Now, I was teaching a Duke stress management class the next morning in the Wilson Gym wrestling room. And I told the pennies from heaven story to the students and said, I think I've had some after-death communications from my dad since he died in 1994, but I never got any mysterious coins. Now, at the end of the class, one of my students who was from the divinity school came up and said, you know, my dad died in 1994 also, like your dad. And at that moment, I looked behind me on the mat, and there was a shiny coin. I hadn't seen it there before, and I picked it up, and before I looked at it, I said, our fathers both died the same year. What date do you think is going to be on this coin? And it was a 1994 dime. And it was like one of those wow moments. I'm going like, okay, that was a shocking synchronicity. And so I handed him the coin and said, you're going to be a minister. You might need this to remind you someday when you're counseling bereaved parishioners. So now I'm going to ask the audience again, how many of you think you might have had any kind of after-death communication? Just put your hand up. Yeah, that's very common. You know, usually close to half the people have had these experiences. So I'm going to conclude with a paper from 1996, which shows that college students, like many of you, who read a book on near-death experiences or listen to a talk like this one, report a reduced fear of death and an increase in spirituality. And I hope that proves true for all of you. I think that's an idea worth spreading. Thanks.